Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War News Update, third part there for the 10th of July 2024. Geopolitics section ensues. We're going to start with Dmitry Medvedev, who is the former president and former prime minister. It's a bit like Putin's done both of those jobs. He's presently deputy of the Security Council, I think. Anyway, Medvedev once more, says Anton Gerashchenko, confirmed that Russia's ultimate goal is destroying Ukraine completely. Should it succeed, Russia won't stop there. Ukrainian victory is the prerequisite of geopolitical security in the region. Translation of an excerpt from Medvedev's Telegram post. So this is Medvedev in his own words. And if you have any doubt about what Russia intend to do, you've got to listen to the Russian leaders tell you in their own words. It's in your face. He says a moderate political regime will emerge on the ruins of the preserved part of the former Ukraine. But even this will not be the end of Russia's military operation. Even after signing the papers and accepting defeat, the remaining radicals will sooner or later return to power after regrouping their forces, inspired by Russia's Western enemies. And then it will be time to finally crush the scum, to drive a long steel nail into the coffin lid of the Banderite quasi-state, destroy the remnants of its bloody legacy and return the remaining lands to the bosom of the Russian land. But Russia's enemies will not go anywhere after that. They will be gathering strength and waiting for a new convenient excuse to destroy our country. We must be ready for future battles to defend the fatherland. So, when you're wondering who should be the next president of the US, for example, do you choose someone that is matey with these kind of people or someone who isn't? NATO is meeting at the moment. There's lots of news coming out from NATO. I've already filled you in on a bunch of it. All interesting there. There's been this whole thing about UK government and 2.5% of GDP to spend on NATO. At the moment, we're, 2.32, 2.39, something like that. But that 2.3 to 2.5 is a lot of billions of pounds, right? UK's Labour will not boost military spend without economic growth, says Minister. So the problem with the UK government at the moment is that they've got loads of big intentions, but there's no money in the coffers. And in order to say raise defence spending by that much, you're going to have to rob Peter to pay Paul. And when you've promised the electorate that you're going to get waiting lists down the NHS, then these things are very difficult. So a lot of what they have been suggesting, or a lot of their manifesto, is contingent upon economic growth in order to boost the coffers, to have more money to be able to spend. So there's a lot riding on our economy doing better. Labour government will not increase spending on the military unless it is also able to grow the economy, the Armed Forces Minister said, as Sir Keir Starmer comes under pressure to say when Britain's defence spending will hit 2.5%. So 2.5% is a part of the manifesto. That's what we are going to do. If we have the money to do it, we will do that. Make of that what you will, but lots going on with regard to NATO at the moment. I guess the basic intentions of Kaja Kallas pretty much sums it up well, the Estonian Prime Minister. Estonia's priorities are to support Ukraine's path to victory and NATO membership, keep the Russian threat at the centre of NATO's priorities, strengthen defence and deterrence, and boost defence spending. And that's part of everyone's remit, really, in being there at NATO. NATO will call for all 32 nations to put in place a civil defence plan at the DC summit to use in case of an Article 5 level attack, officials told. NATO wants nations to prep for Russian attacks that could hit ports, bases and energy. It absolutely needs to happen. Like there's one thing having Article 5. Yeah, we've got this thing that if one person gets attacked, we'll all pile in to help them. But if you don't actually plan for what that looks like, how that works, and in the same way that NATO need to plan for an all-out European war, how would they move troops and equipment from that part of Europe to the eastern edge of Europe? Like literally, physically, how do you move troops and equipment around? So NATO have been planning this for some time. I was listening to an analysis on that on Ukraine, the latest sometime back, where there's a lot of thought going into, the use of railways, etc., etc. Well, each individual country needs a plan, a civil defense plan. Like, what do we do if we're at war? if we go into DEFCON 5 or whatever it is, what does that look like? What are the protocols and the different steps you have to take in order to achieve whatever goal it is? So there's a lot of careful thinking needs to happen in every member state in order to be as prepared as possible for any eventual outcome. Prior planning prevents piss poor performance. So let's get all those P's in order. Right, talking about NATO, this blew my mind, as I keep saying that at the moment because things just blow my mind. I still don't understand how people can consider voting for this guy when we're worrying about World War III, and he's like, oh, what's NATO? I didn't even know what NATO was when I became president of the USA.
I didn't even know what the hell NATO was too much before, but it didn't take me long to figure it out, like about 2 minutes. And the first thing I figured out was they weren't paying. We were paying almost fully for NATO.
Again, I'm sorry to say the same thing over and over, but he says, it only took me a few minutes to understand what NATO was. So A, he became president and didn't understand what NATO was. B, it just took a couple of minutes and understood it. And C, right now, 8 years after he first became president, he still doesn't know what NATO was because he just said, listen to what he said, and to show you how he doesn't understand how NATO works.
Almost fully for NATO.
We paid almost fully for NATO, like it's this thing. You're spending on your defense. You're not paying for a thing. You're not paying fully for it. It's not a freaking pizza. You're paying for your defense. Everyone needs to pay for their defense. To the point where if they're called on to help each other when Article 5 is triggered, everyone is in a position to be able to do that, right? And 23 of those nations are doing that. Some not so much though. Some who aren't doing that need to spend more. Canada is one that's often mentioned. We'll talk about them in a second. But it's just it just blows my mind that this guy is taken seriously at all. He just says, his Miami rally was bonkers. What he was saying, we can complain about Biden, fumbling around and brain freezing, but do you know what? Okay, but when he is making sense, it's sensible, substantive stuff. It's not just crazy out bonkers stuff that just. And then talking about Hannibal Lecter again. And talking honestly, the rally was just it's just bonkers. Now, if you think I'm being harsh on Republicans, I'm not, because I'm going to give serious props to Mitch McConnell, who is not someone I've ever previously liked at all, right? But here, he's absolutely on point, right? Talking about NATO, answering a question here.
Well, with regard to the administration, that's a good question to ask the next group. Before recent times, it was pretty obvious to any observers that we had big power competition from China and Russia, a great ally for them in Iran, and Iran funding the proxies. I mean, this is clearly the most dangerous period since right before World War II. So completely unrelated to who happens to be in the White House at the moment, we need to step up. And a good time to emphasize that is while NATO is celebrating its 75th anniversary right here in Washington. We need to make it clear that we're behind NATO. There are allies in Indo-Pacific who are here as well. Every democratic country in the world is together against this coterie of authoritarians. And what a great time to emphasize that we're all together. I had a similar conversation yesterday with the president of Latvia. I mean, they're right up next to the Russians. And then the majority leader and I and some others met with the Canadian Prime Minister. With all due respect to our Canadian friends, they're a long way from hitting the 2% mark. But a whole lot of the rest of the NATO members have. We only had 3 countries hitting the 2% mark a few years ago. Now we have 23. So I think everybody who elects their government realizes we're all in this together.
What a great message there from Mitch McConnell, right? A Republican who is nailing it. We are all in this together. It's bloody important that we get to 2% spending on defence as a percentage of GDP. Not like Trump that's banging on still about, oh, like we're paying for everything. Hey, it's like a big night out. And why is it that we're paying for this big night out? And you guys, it's not understanding how NATO works and also belittling NATO and the importance of the whole thing. Like, here's someone that's standing up and saying, I understand what's going on in the Indo-Pacific. I understand what's going on in Europe. I understand that threat that both China and Russia are. I understand that we've got Indo-Pacific allies that are here today, that NATO's here today for the 75th anniversary. And this is really damned important. And we need to make sure that we are working together to be as unified as we possibly can to defend our own interests against those of you can throw Iran and I would assume North Korea in on that. Meanwhile, Trump is like, yeah, I'm going to pull us out of NATO. And yet he's now favourite to win the election. Just insane. So dangerous. The Czech Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jan Lipavsky, announced he summoned the Russian ambassador in Prague and instructed him to deliver the message to Moscow. This is obviously after the attack on the hospital. Quote, murderers who attack children in hospitals are the dregs of humanity. I love that. Write it on a post-it note. Can you give that to Putin, please? Go give that to Putin. Oh, and bracket, you knob. Give that to Putin, and then Putin opens it up and is like, oh my God. Because, I must listen to it. There's one of the questions I've been consistently asking for the last couple of years, you would have heard me ask this so often, is how much does Putin know? Like, he lives in an information bubble. He doesn't use the internet. He doesn't have a smartphone, etc., etc. So all the information he gets is very carefully cultivated, curated for him and delivered to him. And I don't know how much he knows about what is going on the front lines, for example, in Ukraine. And there's a Times radio video that was out recently, and I haven't watched it. It was like, how much does Putin know? Or does Putin realise what's going on? And so on and so forth, something like that. And it's exactly what I'd like to know, because, I wonder if he would receive, if some message did get through to him, he's like, what? I thought we're absolutely spanking them in. I mean, there must be some realisation it's not going very well, because it's 2.5 years later and it's only supposed to last 3 days, right? So there must be some kind of knowledge that it's not going very well for the Russians. Anyway, I digress. Saudi Arabia has threatened the G7 countries to get rid of all EU securities if the EU confiscate $300 billion in the Russian assets, Bloomberg has reported. According to the publication's estimates, Saudi Arabia does not have many European bonds, but EU officials fear that other countries will follow suit. So there's so much going on beneath the radar with regard to everything, really. Everything affects everything else. And so when you make these what seem like big, sensible and morally correct decisions like confiscating Russian assets and using them to support Ukraine, there are so many things connected to that, and other entities who aren't so obviously in support of Ukraine, who don't want that to take place, and will be putting pressure on European players to make sure that doesn't happen. Switzerland has announced new sanctions against Russia. This is good. I assume probably in line with the EU, as they're not members of the EU. Switzerland announced new sanctions against Russia on July the 8th, bringing the country further in line with the EU's 14th round of sanctions adopted in response to the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And Ukraine has signed a security agreement with Luxembourg. So that's really good. Lithuania has allocated 1 million euros for the reconstruction of the Children's Hospital. And Japan has handed over 2 demining machines to State Emergency Services of Ukraine. There's an extra few bits of military aid that I didn't talk about earlier. Right, Mark Rutte is expected, so the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, who is due to take over as Secretary General of NATO with the outgoing, obviously you've got the outgoing Jens Stoltenberg. He is going to be going to Turkey soon to meet Erdogan, which is good news. Turkish officials confirmed the government will be supporting Mark Rutte's candidacy for NATO Secretary General. Turkish president pressed on him at the end of last week. Counter-terrorism, especially the PKK, defense cooperation and embargo lifting. So Turkey will be trying to use a bit of leverage here in say, it's all going to happen. It will be fine. Great support. We'll give you all the support you need and then it's always about the PKK. So these are the Kurdish, what they see as terrorists living in or operating in Turkey. There's a really big issue that Erdogan particularly and his party have with the PKK and with the Kurds. And then defense cooperation and embargo lifting. So Turkey might want certain embargoes are lifting on them, maybe even on Russia, who knows, that might benefit them. But anyway, who else is visiting? Well, that's going to happen in the future, but who else is visiting Turkey? Well, who knew? It's Lord Jabba the Hutt. Or Viktor Orban is now on his way to Turkey to meet his peace initiative with, or discuss his peace initiative with Erdogan. He's gone from Zelensky to Putin to Xi Jinping and now to Erdogan. He's doing a whole lot. Why is he doing this? According to Orban, Erdogan proved himself as a successful mediator in the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine during the signing of the Grain Initiative. And indeed, have I got it here? Yeah, anonymous EU diplomats told Politico that there is, quote, very clear political disapproval of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban's recent trips to Moscow and Beijing, possibly jeopardizing Hungary's presidency in the EU Council. And indeed, I think yes, this is it. So Steve Rosenberg, as I said previously, talks about how these meetings are with Donald Trump in mind. So more on Viktor Orban in today's Russian newspapers. One claims he's, quote, trying to put the brakes on the war train. Another suggests he's preparing peace initiatives with the return of Donald Trump in mind. So I think he's gathering information for Donald Trump. He's such a big fan of, and Trump is a fan of Orban, that he very much wants Trump to succeed in the US elections and is taking a very Trumpian Project 2025 probably position on Ukraine in terms of appeasement, and this doesn't bode well going forward. On the other hand, Peter Magyar, the Hungarian opposition politician who's suddenly sprung forth, he's going to Ukraine tomorrow. He will bring a humanitarian woman for the affected children. I don't quite know what that means. Magyar condemned Russia's attack on the children's hospital and criticised the Hungarian Prime Minister for his trip to Moscow. So actually he would be there today. So this was written yesterday. Peter Magyar is considered the main competitor of Viktor Orban. He's not opposed to the EU and NATO and has no sympathy for the Russian Federation and is in favour of helping Ukraine. So if you want to support anyone, it's not Orban, it is this guy. Of those two choices, this is your clear winner in my books. Now, Poland has stopped allowing trucks at the checkpoint, the Kozlovice checkpoint on the Belarusian border. This was reported by Customs Committee of Belarus. The agency says that since 3 a.m. on July the 10th, the Polish side no longer accepts trucks coming from Belarus. So interesting development there. Japan has arrested the first Russians that they have done for sanctions evasion. A Russian has been arrested in Japan on suspicion of evading sanctions for the first time, according to Nikkei. Sova is suspected of exporting dual-use items to South Korea via a container ship in January 2023, despite knowing that the items were subject to export restrictions, Japanese newspaper Chunichi Shimbun said. Okay, moving on. Iranian president-elect assures Putin of a continued partnership, according to Russians. Iran is prepared to sign a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with Russia on the BRICS summit at the BRICS summit in Kazan in October. Masoud Pezeshkian reportedly told Putin. So they just had an election for a new president who is supposedly a, scare quotes, reformist. I say scare quotes because there is no reformist really in Iran, and you only get to do whatever the Ayatollah dictates you can do. So this is very much, I think, for show rather than being in reality. And he's already, already endorsed proxies and military groups like Hezbollah and whatever. You know, this is more of the same, undoubtedly. And, you know, getting to bed with Russia or showing continued support, close support for Russia is just evidence that this is more of the same. Now, the Clooney Foundation, so George Clooney and his wife, who is a human rights lawyer, the Clooney Foundation for Justice, CFJ, a legal action worldwide, and Truth Hounds said on July the 10th, so today, that they had filed a landmark complaint, interesting to see what that might be, to the UN Human Rights Committee over a Russian missile attack against Vinnytsia in 2022. Representing families of 18 Ukrainian victims, the NGOs said that the case could set a precedent applicable to thousands more civilians killed during Russia's full-scale war. There will be legal ramifications. Whether anything eventually gets resolved in those cases with regard to reparations or anything, I guess we won't know. And it may never happen. But at least those things are put in place so people are under no illusion as to who the bad guys are in this war. Thierry's just sent me a really good infographic on the French elections. I was asking the other day for an update on not just the coalitions, but actually the parties within the coalitions. So you've got this coalition of 143 that is a number of different parties. On the far right, you've got a coalition in the middle of 168. That's a centrist coalition. And you've got the left wing of 182. So the left wing has the biggest coalition. Centrist has the next biggest. The far right has the third biggest. And then the right, the centre right, Les Républicains and Droite, have the fourth biggest. So this shows you that kind of scare quotes, the left won, as in that coalition got the most, but that coalition is a broad coalition with many different positions within it. The centrists did really well, but actually the party that did the best, because this far right coalition is essentially mainly, almost entirely, Rassemblement National. So they got the largest number out of that. So 126 for Rassemblement National there against 102 for Renaissance, which is Macron's centrist, or actually slightly centre-right, to be honest. And then the LFI, the left wingers, they're getting 74. And it's not looking like anyone's agreeing to. There doesn't seem to be a coalition that's able to pick up the mantle and run with it. It's still a bit of a debate as to what is going to take place. You can see from the previous election how much of a hit the centre took, going from 246 down to 168 as a coalition. The left has grown and the far right has grown. The centre right has shrunk a little bit, and the centrists as well, who are actually, as I say, marginally centre right. So there you go. That is what's going on. I'll try and keep you updated as to who will become prime minister, how. I think there's probably going to be some kind of political paralysis that may play into the far right's hands, but for the time being, it might be the least worst option for Ukraine. We're going to return back to Trump here because Republican Party's National Committee approved its 2024 electoral platform on July the 8th, entitled America First, A Return to Common Sense. The platform makes no mention of Russia, Ukraine, or the full-scale invasion, which I think is really interesting, that there's no space for discussion of foreign policy, almost like the election is not going to consider that, even though I think we're in the process of being involved in World War III. And yet it's not important to talk about it possibly because actually they have such a controversial, at least Trump's republicanism has such a controversial approach to foreign diplomacy compared to, say, Mitch McConnell, right? Mitch McConnell has it right. He knows what's going on. He knows his onions, compared to someone like Trump, who I think is best will in the world. He's ignorant. I mean, I don't mean that as a pejorative. He doesn't know. Even though he was in charge, he never read any intelligence reports in the morning. Like, he's famous for not reading intelligence reports. You had to present him to him, and if you showed him stuff, you had to show him stuff with pictures on. Again, I'm not lying. This is what it was like having him as president, and I think we forget that. We forget some of the things he said and some of the things he did. And I think going forward, we have an issue that foreign matters don't feature so highly for him, and yet they are freaking important. Was interesting is that in the UK, the only party that also didn't have Ukraine mentioned at all in their manifesto, the only party, even the Greens talk strong on supporting Ukraine. Lib Dems, Labour, Conservative, all very strong on Ukraine. The only one was Reform. Reform didn't mention Ukraine at all. And Nigel Farage is in the mold of Trump there. They are friends. They're starting to use, Farage is starting to use the same language. He's starting to use nicknames for other politicians. It was really interesting. I watched, because this is how cool I am. Yesterday, as I was doing some work, I listened to the whole of the new Parliament going through the rituals of the Black Rod and all the going from the Lords to the House of Commons, and I listened to every single speech. And what happened there is you get the nomination of the new speaker, who is the same speaker as Lindsay Hoyle, who's brilliant, this northerner from Lancashire, Chorley man, who is been a brilliant speaker for the last few years, however long he has been. And he's a Labour guy, but he's supposed to be independent, right? So he's the guy that chairs speeches in the House of Commons. It can be from any party. You elect someone who's right for the job, and they try and be neutral and try and say, oh, you need to stop talking. You're not allowed to say that. You need to apologise for that. And they chair everything that goes on, and they're not allowed to be involved in campaigning either. So the people step aside in their constituency when you have a new election coming up. The speaker doesn't get challenged in their constituency, and actually his constituents really like him. He's a very likable guy. And so you had his speech, you had all these nominations, and then you had the speeches of all the heads of each of the parties, and that includes all the small Northern Irish parties, Scottish SNP, Plaid Cymru, and all the main parties. And you had the mother and father of the House speaking as well, who's a woman and the man who've served the longest in Parliament, and they become the mother and father of the House, and they make a speech, and it was so lovely. The whole experience was absolutely lovely. The speeches from everyone were delightful, heartwarming, a peaceful transfer of power, the respect everyone's giving each other. Even though these are politicians that take bites out of each other normally, they spoke with such respect and warmth and care and respect. It was a lovely experience until there was one person who was an absolute knob on the day. And who was it? It was Nigel Farage. Stood up and just said he was the only person that said inappropriate things and was slagging off the previous speaker, not that speaker, but the previous speaker that he had beef with. I think he called him an odious little man or something. And everyone was like, oh, it was sort of booze and whatnot. It's like, that tells you what kind of a human being that guy is. And it reminded me of Trump, I had to say. And like Nigel Farage stood up and just was the only human being in that whole time that said anything controversial. Just like typical. Anyway, now this is something I am deeply worried about, because I've talked to you before about how I see there's this association with Putinism in Russia and the illiberalism of those hardcore ultra-conservative viewpoints to say treating LGBT as terrorists, as extremists. They're designated extremists in Russia now, which plays well with conservative religionists in, say, on the far right of the spectrum in the US. And so you're starting to get a lot of rhetoric that looks very similar across these countries. And I pointed out a pastor the other day who was involved in he was going for governor. He's one of the governors, Republican anyway, who was talking about how liberals should be killed, right? And this is Tim Pool. So if you don't know Tim Pool is massive in the social media world, in the Republican infosphere, right? And this is what he said, and this worries the hell out of me. This, honestly, the state of play for in the political landscape in the US is deeply, deeply worrying.
Should Democrats be in jail? No question. When Donald Trump gets elected, should he start locking them up? No question. Should there be lists of Democrats that need to go to jail? 100%. And the reason for that is they've committed crimes. We need to make sure that when Donald Trump wins, we've got an attorney general, a deputy attorney general, a head of the CIA and the FBI. Kash Patel would be fantastic. We can have attorney general. There's some names floating around. And then they can start having their investigators and the feds issuing subpoenas, pulling up evidence, and with real evidence, bring them to judges for warrants. Then these people can spend three years of their lives fighting tooth and nail for the crime against the government for crimes they committed, and we can prove. Yeah. And the reason why we put them on trial is that we can show the whole world we will uncover what you've done. We will make sure everyone knows, and you will be held accountable for it.
Not just jail, they should get the death penalty. You know, we actually used to have the punishment for treason in this country.
And there you go. So let's
Should Democrats be in jail? No question.
Let's round up Democrats. Be really retributive. Let's go for complete revenge. Round all these Democrats up, and hey, let's just suggest that we get the death penalty back for treason and execute them. This is not cool. He is, if you don't know him, he's unfortunately has a huge following. They have since scrubbed this video from YouTube. Who knew? Who knew? I mean, that's an acceptance that was not a good look. But that is what they are saying. And then they are saying it far too frequently for my liking. And it's all part of Project 2025. I showed you yesterday about like stacking not just the judiciary with your people, but Project 2025 suggests stacking, the courts lower down, but then the FBI and whatnot until you get, everyone is a loyalist up and down all of these institutions and hierarchies, so that there's just no comeback, and it basically you might as well be living in Stasi run East Germany. I mean, gee whiz, this is honestly like, should we start dressing people up in Handmaid's Tale outfits? Like, what? It's just deeply worrying. I'm so deeply worried about the state of affairs in many places around the world. Anyway, thanks for watching. Take care. Speak soon. Toodle pips.